The unfinished Swan, developed by Giant Sparrow and SCE Santa Monica Studios, is a rather unique game, in the same family as titles like Portal and Tag. After a brief introduction, the main character, a lonely orphan named Monroe, follows the yellow footprints of his mother's unfinished swan painting through a door where the game begins in earnest. So how does the game teach you to play? The simple answer is that it doesn't. When the game opens, all you see is a white void with barely a foot shadow to indicate that you're in a space and an aiming dot at the center of the screen. Should you wait for an instruction prompt, you're going to be waiting a long time, as after a full 2 minutes of waiting around, nothing appeared when I tried it. The obvious answer here is that you need to click with your mouse, and when you're due, you're rewarded with a satisfying splat of black ink. This first paint bomb will likely prompt a spamming of ink all over the game, and as you move around, you seemingly reveal the landscape created by the game makers. While the puzzle in the first level is honestly rather simple, the game keeps it interesting by giving you world-building surprises as you move along and through the collection of often brightly colored balloons. Later rooms in this section provide more complex puzzles, and the ramping here is very clean. It's almost something of a disappointment when you reach the second level and find the aesthetic has changed. You no longer need to create the environment as you explore it. Level 2 replaces your ink bomb with a water bomb. It can both layer on top of itself, making depth assessment a little easier, and it disappears, adding to the difficulty in certain areas. Brightly colored wheels and knobs tempt you into throwing water bombs and reward you by letting you move forward in the story. You are now able to manipulate vines and guide them around the environment, showing off what an environment looks like and adding a climbable face to move through. This too ramps up as you move through the level before being dismissed for the third act. The night level is the most different from the other two. While there's still use for your liquid bomb, you spend about half the level without finding much use for it beyond lighting the lamps you come across. In a way, this in itself is ramping of difficulty, as now you have to traverse terrain and find your way without the benefit of seeing where you're going. This is also the first section with enemies that can kill you. Spiders. The spider's danger is introduced abruptly, as you get clawed for the first time in an unavoidable dash to the next area. This section of the game leaves the player feeling the most helpless, as your liquid bombs can do nothing beyond bouncing a moving light towards the goal, or brightening the luminosity of certain hanging ones. Towards the end of the section, the game takes a more meta turn, allowing the player to manipulate the environment by using the water bomb to build stepping blocks in a blueprint-style area before replicating it in the main dark environment. This section takes a little bit of practice, and the mechanics here are not as instinctual to figure out, though the desired outcome ends up fairly obvious. From this area, you are transported to a flooding island, which forces you to contend with rising water, which is instant death, and where once again your liquid bombs don't particularly have a use. Upon reaching the top, you find the remainder of the plot and play through the Sleeping King's dream of everything that's transpired since Monroe entered the scene. While you do reuse certain mechanics, notably the growing vines and in one section the block building, the mechanics central to the first section of the game is largely lost. So how did the gaming community respond? Reviews of the unfinished Swan are overwhelmingly favorable. The game, which can be completed in 2 hours without needing to be speedrun, uses a variety of unique mechanics that, on the whole, have little time to get stale. Metacritic scored it at around 80%, while Steam rates it at very positive, and IGN gave it a 9 out of 10. User reviews that scored it poorly cited a short runtime, simplistic gameplay, and the loss of relevance to the main mechanic towards the end of the game. For the most part, this game relies on situated cognition and experiential learning. The beginning of the game shows no prompts of any kind, and you learn the controls as you go, through trial and error. Much of the early gameplay involves exploring the environment and situating yourself as the sole objective. This does begin to change a little further down the road, as later there are a few examples of direct instruction, the fire hose and the telescope. Otherwise, most other elements of the game are judgment calls for the player to learn with. One of the other mechanics the game uses to propel the player further into the gameplay is by adding collectible balloons as a type of badging. These balloons, when fully collected, open up certain toys and other extra content, such as concept art and access to the original prototype. The way that the game assesses the player is incorporated directly into the objective. The goal is to make it to the end of the section and ultimately the level. If you've made it to the end, then you've achieved the learning goal. This can be tricky, as many of the levels require a fair amount of logical reasoning, as there aren't really any hints or tutorials to be had throughout the game. The fact that the game is able to explain the goal it sets for you without using prompting is pretty impressive. Experiential learning is a great way to promote creative problem solving. Although I played this game alone, I found myself thinking out loud a lot of the time, and I could see groups of young players working together to understand the implicit goals of each area and the best ways to go about solving the puzzles. Much of the gameplay requires creative solutions, and this kind of game promotes experimentation and iteration. Death is more or less inconsequential. You have an infinite number of chances to get it right. While it is a little disappointing to perform incorrectly and die, the only real outcome is that you have to try again and think of a different solution. The game will never set you back so far that you can't recover. This kind of structure takes the negative associations with failure out of appropriate risk-taking. The major takeaway from the unfinished Swan is that we as gamers create our own stories, our own experiences through the way that we play games. Nowhere is that more apparent than in the first section of the unfinished Swan, where we're given the task of painting the blank canvas however we see fit, to reveal the story and the world underneath. The game sets out to tell us that it's okay for something to be left half-finished. If you color an entire area of the map with color, you'll be just as lost as if you'd left it completely blank. It's through this ambiguity and half-finished coloring that we can see the details and leave our mark on the page. From what can be seen in the prototype and from much of the way the game was constructed in its final form, it seems that this half-finished coloring book has been the original design choice all along. They wanted the players to take an even more active role in the creation of the game than most titles, allowing players to draw on the world and even create the platforms on which they use to get to the goal. While some elements did this more effectively than others, it's clear that the designers wanted to give us, the players, the opportunity to build the game with them as we played it. Just as the narrative wants Monroe to learn that he can paint with his mother, using the tools and guidelines that she left behind. Somewhat ironically, my biggest disappointment with the game is that it feels unfinished. The ramping structure, the building up of the different mechanics, ink blots, water bombs, whirligigs, moving lights, and platform creation, seems like it wants to come to a head, a level where you must deal with all of these things in turn. Instead, the final levels of the game only give brief nods to each area, and with minor exceptions, there's no need to perform the aforementioned tasks as you travel once again through the levels. It seems odd, as the storyline wraps itself up in a neat little bow. It is the gameplay that ultimately leaves the player feeling unfinished, as if there should be a final level where you get to demonstrate to the game developers all that you've learned and share with them your progress. I would rather that the narrative have been the open-ended portion of the game, leaving the ambiguity of meaning open to interpretation rather than halting the gameplay to finalize the narrative of Little Orphan Monroe. It just felt like the gameplay was ramping to somewhere that the developers kept just out of reach. They even added some new mechanics, such as the mirrors, that felt like they had somewhere to go, but never did. It makes you wonder if this release that we have now is everything they had planned for the game, or simply what they'd completed for the initial release date, leaving everything else ultimately unfinished.